Congratulations all on the film. I'm sure that people in the audience here are here to see it for the second time. I gather some third, fourth time as well. And for me, it was great to revisit it after seeing it first in June, because it was, the first time. It's so assaultive. You're bombarded emotionally and sensorially by what's on screen and what's coming out of the speakers. And I expected the second time around to be a much more cooler, analytic experience. And it just really wasn't. It caught me off guard in exactly the same way. So I was wondering, for all three of you, if you had a particular moment in the film, even though you've been sitting with it for so long, from writing or playing it on set or in the edit suite, that still kind of catches you off guard.
Well, I mean, I obviously have seen the film many, many times throughout. I mean, I think more than any of my other films, because with the structure that the film has, every time we would make a change to a scene, we would actually have to screen the entire film to see what the knock-on effect on the structure was. If we moved a scene around or something. So you get somewhat immune to the charms of the film, but it's really the parts that, in a way, I had the least to do with that still sort of get me. And one moment I like to talk about is the moment when Tom Glencarney's character, when he sort of spares Cillian Murphy's character the truth, and Mark's reaction to that wasn't. I sort of left that out of the script by mistake. And you're sort of writing all the different characters, but you don't necessarily take everything into consideration, and then you get the actors involved, and Mark had read it and sort of said, well, what happens between us in that moment? And we'd addressed it and talked about it, and then really just, he just did something on the day, which is this sort of look of, I suppose you just call it approval, really. And every time I see the film, it sort of gets me. I think probably because it was something that I had very little to do with, so it, I just find his performance in that moment really, really moving.
Emma, how about you?
I think that the thing that's always surprising to me actually is how the film sort of has an impact on me emotionally every time I see it, and it's actually some of the they don't even have to be moments of. Well, not that there's much dialogue in the film anyway. They're not sort of the more obvious emotional moments. It's more, the shot of the Moonstone travelling along next to the large destroyer full of soldiers. That sort of gets to me every time. But also, things like the end with Finn's character reading the speech, which is just such a sort of different. I think, the fact that it's not a recording of Winston Churchill. It's not what you expect, and I think that the sort of power of a young boy's voice reading that speech sort of makes you listen, you hear it in a different way, and sort of really understand sort of what's just happened, and sort of understand the impact of the power of it in a different way.
Ken.
I got the chance to watch the film 3 times in relatively quick succession, and like you, Robbie, actually, I found that it was a more powerful experience each time, and certainly very, as Emma said, very moving in some direct ways and some surprising ways. I also really was struck by how sort of brave it was, and somehow natural it was to end back in a small human moment, but with the grand words and brilliant words that summed up the moment historically. But just ahead of that, I find myself, as I watched it, very touched by the sort of the mix-up, as it were. Blind man says well done and is not acknowledged as blind man by soldier who thinks that he can't look him in the face. That suddenly that felt like a little Thomas Hardy moment at the end there, of just a missed two people in the same moment, misunderstanding to sort of great effect. And
the other Thomas Hardy.
Yeah, the other Thomas Hardy.
That was, I think it's a fantastic moment. It really took me aback. Chris, can I ask where it came from? Was that from veterans' testimony, or
the moment with the blind man? No, I mean it's it's my attempt to try and do something Chaplin-esque, and I'm a huge admirer of the silent era of films, and I'm very inspired by that. And both Murnau and Chaplin and many others, they would sort of find some way to, I suppose, sentimentalize something in a way, but in a more visual way, with a little misunderstanding, or if you think of City Lights or something. So I think it's sort of being inspired to try and find some slight moment like that could play primarily visual, and it's just the feeling of misunderstanding that I think you find in great silent cinema. So I'd look at City Lights or Sunrise, something like that.
Emma, you mentioned that the dialogue in the film was incredibly pared down, and Ken, I'm interested in how, as an actor, you react to something like that, because your character is coming at this conflict from a different angle to the boys around him. He's presumably old enough to have served in the First World War. So there's not this, he has the same kind of mortal panic, but I sensed a kind of a disbelief and a bewilderment in his experience as well, that he was sort of where he was. He couldn't almost believe that he was there, in a way that the younger kids, they've never experienced anything like this before, and so it was a different kind of thing for them. But given that you don't have this opportunity to say, well, back in the trenches, lads, I had this experience and blah, 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 and it'll all come good in the end, how do you put that into the performance? Do you look for little gestures or interactions with other cast members?
Well, some of it was simply provided by my first morning going to work was to walk up the vast stretch of that beach, so to feel under your feet the length and breadth and width of this big piece of land upon which 400,000 folk were stranded at that time. So you get a sense of the immensity of it, and then to walk out across that same platform, the mole, and get to the end of it, and then spend our days there basically, and see and react to real boats and real aeroplanes, and what seemed like to me like thousands and thousands of men who, because it was a narrow walkway, said good morning to everybody. He said good morning about 1,000 times on the way to the end of the mole, and then there was a sense that I was slipstreaming Chris in some ways, because there he was really at the prow of that particular ship, orchestrating all of this, and so there was just a sensory feeling of taking in all of that, and whatever else he had to do or whatever else he might have felt, there was this constant, and the set provided it, assessment, analysis, reaction to an enormous amount of noise, a vast number of people, certainly across any given day, many changes of weather and temperature, and whilst of course impossible to remotely sense what it could have been like there, everything that a movie could do and a creative act to recreate it was happening, and was creating a happening for the people who were experiencing it. So the job was to try and be in that real moment that Emma and Chris created with the production to be as authentic as you could to that.
I think the authenticity comes across incredibly powerfully in those moments when they're being dive bombed by the Messerschmitts, and it's interesting because it's easy to imagine, I think, what the more conventional CG version of that scene would be. You'd be far closer in on the plane. It would be rendered in a way to look how wonderfully realistically we can recreate this old vehicle in CG. But in the compositions that you've used, the plane is at a distance, and you're not it's this kind of much more remote, anonymous threat. And to me, it almost seemed like you're sort of shooting action like tension, like in North by Northwest with the crop duster scene. It's much more stark. You've got wide spaces and things. So, Chris, can you tell me about using that language of tension and bringing it to what most people would consider a kind of an action premise?
Yeah, in considering how to take on the story of Dunkirk, and it's a story that Emma and I have been looking for a way to tell for a long time, what I decided to do was concentrate on the elements that distinguish it, what's different about the story. And for me, it's that it's a very, very clearly a survival story. And so the language of the suspense thriller felt like the appropriate language more than of the action film or the straight war film. And so I really tried to view things through that prism. And so I looked at a lot of the masters of suspense, Hitchcock, obviously, Clouseau, and various others, things like Clouseau's Wages of Fear,
And the tribute to bringing the stretcher across that little bit on the mole with the broken wood and the
Yeah.
one remaining plank.
Well, and exactly because what those filmmakers understood is that suspense is the most visual of languages. You do the least with dialogue in a way, and you do the most with physical process. And so it's about things like that scenario with the plank and can they get across, and I'm thinking of Wages of Fear with the wooden platform, the spinning tires and everything, and the detail. Bresson as well, very good on detail and creating suspense through detail. And so the way the airplanes figure into that was, we really wanted to be from the point of view of the people who would suffer that bombardment and really present it in a very realistic way. And so computer graphics did not feel like they would ever have the correct patina for the film. Everything's shot on very, very high resolution, large negative film. And so it's difficult to pepper sort of CG creations into that. You're going to get an unevenness of tone. So we really tried to find in-camera approaches and keep things at the appropriate distances. I mean, even the way we've done it, we're still cheating the airplanes closer, and we were in the air-to-air sequences as well, because the reality is, airplanes function, very much at a distance. I mean, there's one shot in the film that I'm particularly pleased with, where you see the Spitfire chasing the 109 from in front, and they come past camera, and it's a relatively sedate shot in the film. But I was in the plane that shot it, and it was absolutely terrifying, because you're flying head-on with two other aircraft, and we went as close as it was safe to go, and it felt absolutely terrifying in the air. But when you look at it on camera, they seem like large distances. So everything in the air plays at very, very much larger distances, which is historically why the people on the ground were very convinced that the Royal Air Force had not done their job. And there was a lot of animosity and a lot of bitterness towards the RAF that Churchill tried to address in his speech, which not in the part that we've included in the film, but he went out of his way to praise the RAF, because with the distances involved, a lot of the people on the beach just couldn't see, what the Air Force were doing, and obviously that's why we have the moment in the film at the dock where it says, where the hell were you?
Emma, just in terms of wrangling the logistics of using these historical vehicles, because I mean the aircraft they're not just period accurate, they are from the period, right? And the boats as well. You sourced boats that had actually made that crossing to do the real rescue. How on earth, in terms of coordinating the production, did you do that? And were there any moments at which you were tempted to say, well, let's just kind of make this work with some kind of a recreation?
I mean, I think, it was enormously important to us to do as much as we could for real. I think it, it really pays off in the film, because I think you really feel like you're there and you can sort of feel the authenticity. And I think that, just being on the real beach itself, it also had an enormous part to play in that. And it was an enormously difficult job to sort of try and source all of that. However, there are a lot of people who care very deeply about both things, both the Spitfires and the real little ships. There's an organisation called the Association of Dunkirk Little Ships, and they absolutely cherish those boats and look after them and get together every year. And in fact, every 5 years they do recreate the journey and go back on the anniversary every 5 years. And so they're real enthusiasts, and they were very enthusiastic about being a part of the film. Dan Friedkin, who owns the Spitfires that we used, actually flew them for us. He's a very busy man, he's a businessman and also now actually a film producer, and he took time and came and was on call for us. It was a very long process. I look back and I can't believe we managed to find those people and those boats and so on, but it was worth it.
And these vehicles had to be fitted with the IMAX cameras that you're using, right, for those on-the-wing shots. The cameras had to be physically strapped on there somehow.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we didn't ever want to have to sort of drill into, period Spitfire. I mean, they're very valuable planes. And, I mean, there are ways of doing those things, but ultimately the most versatile solution to how to get the cockpit shots was to acquire a cheaper plane called a Yak. It's a Romanian plane. It's about the same size and shape as a Spitfire. And we could, because we owned it, we could build the camera mounts we wanted on the wing, It took months to do that because the IMAX camera is huge, and so the aerodynamics change greatly. So you'd have to build part of the camera mount, adjust the trims, carefully over time, and then eventually mount this camera on this plane that has 2 cockpits. So we could put the actor in the front cockpit and have a real pilot in the rear cockpit actually flying the plane and flying formation with our Spitfires, and in that way get real shots of the actor up, with the Spitfires in the background going through the action. And it took a lot. I mean, it was a huge effort to do that. But what Hoyte van Hoytema, my director of photography, and myself had realized, looking back at all the great movies of the past that had had terrific aerial sequences, the one thing that tended to show the artifice were the shots of the actors in the cockpits. The lighting was a little controlled. They were clearly shot green screen or indoors with backings or whatever. So we were determined to try and get rid of that artifice and make shots that really felt as authentic as all the air-to-air stuff.
Do you think that authenticity could have been achieved 10 years ago? Because, I mean, The Dark Knight was the first Hollywood feature that used IMAX cameras, right? Yeah. So presumably this technology has advanced to an extent since then, and you can now do things with the cameras that you couldn't do back then.
Well, somewhat the technology has advanced, but I think it's more we're less afraid of it than we were. I think, the first time we worked with IMAX cameras, and they are enormous. I mean, it's the size of a microwave oven, and it makes a crazy noise that, for guys like Ken to act in front of is a little bit problematic. So we would mix formats with a quieter camera. In the past, we've done it with 35mm. In this film, we did everything 65mm. So we mixed it with, 5-perf 65mm, which is what Lawrence of Arabia was shot on or whatever. So we've got better and better and more daring, I suppose, with using the cameras. And Hoyte van Hoytema pushed the guys at Panavision, the guys at IMAX, to make new lenses, new lens mounts, so that we could make a periscope lens that would allow us to mount the camera behind the pilot and have the lens right over his shoulder, that kind of thing. So we found ways to deal with the large size of the cameras. And they've become technologically more sophisticated in certain ways, but at the end of the day, it's an analog format with a huge negative that has to be run, through this mechanism, and so it's always going to be a large, cumbersome format. But it's, I just think it looks tremendous.
Ken, can you tell me a bit about acting around these contraptions? I mean, does it change, your particular process working in front of IMAX than it would in front of digital?
Well, I guess you act quite quickly because the takes are short. I think what you value is there's a sort of sense of event every time, because it's just to see the camera being used so often in handheld mode was to see Hoyte sort of gather himself slightly. The blood would drain from his face a bit as he realized he was going to have to hoist this big thing up there again. And then so many variables were happening. He was then pointing it at a ship that was moving up and down and in and out, and all sorts of real-time things were happening. Part of, I guess, what Chris was going for and Hoyte were going for was capturing that. So it made it exciting, and frankly, in terms of the noise of it, you ended up again playing a reality of, well, I'm sure it was noisy then, and there are all sorts of other noises going on in this set, and I should probably speak in a way that would allow me to be heard by the person I need to speak to in this tense situation. So it kept coming back to a kind of sort of authentic mirroring of certain kinds of dynamics that must have been at play there.
Given that Chris's team of regular collaborators, both in terms of cast members and your crew as well, this is your second film with Hoyte after Interstellar, and many other crew members have been involved in previous productions. Ken, did you notice a kind of a synergy or a rapport that was kind of defined the Christopher Nolan way of working, that you kind of noticed on set for a few days, that you kind of took a while to get into?
The impression I had was of something very evolved and natural. It was highly professional and sort of organized, which I was certain that one would expect. For me, what was very pleasing to be a part of, and what was very impressive, was the degree to which Emma and Chris had both, in terms of production logistics, clearly done so much sort of preparation for all of this. So you felt very much welcomed into something that was really well organized, to put it sort of as blandly sounding as that, but was then ready to respond to, as mentioned, so many variables that although there was a super kind of assured and I'd say happy and fun, seriously fun kind of approach to it, there was also this necessary improvisational quality, which was also very impressive when you realized that I read a magnificent screenplay that clearly massive amounts of thought and calculation had gone into, but there also seemed to be this great big readiness for the adventure of that day, of that scene, of that bit of acting, of that great new thought about the shot, or the way that plane was making that kind of banking movement. That seemed to me a great example of people working at a very high level who were ready in the creative, artistic moment to change, evolve, adapt, seize that opportunity if they felt it was right to do. So it was both, very sort of, there was a sort of readiness that did lead to really quite a lot of excitement on the day. And to my amazement from both of them, a capacity to have some fun along the way. So, I've worked a lot of instances where that big effort is so sort of all-consuming and requires such concentration, people can be pretty glum. These two managed to do all that and still smile and say the same 1,000 hellos on the way out to the end of the mole, and that seemed to me was impressive. But most of all, it was a welcoming and creative atmosphere to be in. So it was a big treat for me.
Chris, I want to ask you about that preparation process, because on this film, even more so than on your others, I think, the screenplay and the soundtrack, and in terms of both Hans Zimmer's score and the live sound of what's going on in the on-screen action, are all incredibly tightly interwoven. So when did Hans come on board with the music? How important was getting that three-strand structure in place? And what kind of came first?
Well, what came first was my approach to writing the screenplay, which was trying to do it according to a certain musical principle that I've used in my other films in the soundtracks. Firstly with Dave Julian, the composer on The Prestige, and then later with Hans and with the sound effects guys. And that was using this musical principle called the shepherd tone, which is it's a sort of, it's the audio equivalent, the musical equivalent of an optical illusion. And so you use ascending notes in the scale to create a corkscrew effect. So the music always feels like it's going up. So we used it in sound effects. We used it for the sound of the bat pod in The Dark Knight. So it never downshifts. It's just always getting higher and higher. And what I did in the screenplay is, using the three strands of the story, I tried to apply that to the actual narrative, so that one story strand is sort of peaking as the next one is gathering steam, and the next one is kind of in the middle. And so you get, at script stage, you've got a kind of series of continually increasingly tense scenes. And I showed that to Hans, and I gave him a recording I made of a pocket watch that I own that has a particularly insistent ticking, and asked him to start making tracks based on that sound and based on heartbeats and footsteps and things like that, and not to write tunes, just to try and come up with moments of suspense and how that could integrate with the soundtrack and with the sound effects. And then I think this was all happening prior to shooting and then during shooting. And I think his biggest sort of musical breakthrough, once it started to happen, was he took the notes that are used to make an air raid siren, the particular note and a particular clash of notes that are always used for that sound, and you have a kind of primal response to it. And he started making music from that. And that wound up being sort of the backbone of a lot of the cues, so that there was this feeling of, there is this continuing feeling of almost panic and suspense through all of the music. And so that became very integrated with the way we edited the film, because we'd be using these rhythmic tracks to do it and passing them on to the sound effects guys, who would therefore be able to use the boat engines to carry the musical rhythm in the film. And so there's a handoff between sound effects and music throughout the track. And it is a track that runs continuously through the entire film. So it's a sort of 100 and whatever minute track, which, we break it off at one point for sort of almost light-hearted effects, relatively light-hearted. But it's this rigid set of rules that Hans and his team were working to for a long time. I mean, I think he spent the better part of a year, doing the music, and it was a tremendous effort by all concerned. And I think they were pretty frustrated with my rule set, if you like, but they got there in the end, and I'm very, very pleased with what they did.
Well, I think what's really interesting to me is that Hans Zimmer is such an incredibly productive composer, and yet his work with you always seems to stand apart from what he does for other people. And is it because you give him these rule sets to work by that maybe he's used to not necessarily having so much direction at the start? I don't know.
Well, I wouldn't want to comment on his other scores, but he's...
oh, no, I mean, goodness, they're terrific, but there's a certain Zimmer brand, I think, that you hear it and you instantly know that it's him.
There
with
is.
yours, it does seem to stand apart. So.
No, he does do... I think he has very much enjoyed the opportunity I've given him to not do the Zimmer thing, if you like, because he's so good at that and gets hired to do that a lot, because that's what people want from him. They want that existing sound. What I enjoyed with Hans when I first started working with him is throwing him a challenge and saying, okay, what can you do that's completely different? Because he's one of the most versatile composers. So if you think of, the score for Driving Miss Daisy, for example, just couldn't be further from The Dark Knight. I mean, that's the sort of the brilliance of the guy. I mean, he's just a great genius. But I think very often there's an expectation from him of a particular approach to the music that he then has to try and, move away from or convince people to move away from. And whereas when we work with Hans, it's very much like, okay, on Interstellar, it was like, all right, just do the score on an organ, do something completely different. We sort of throw different challenges at him. And I think he's always really enjoyed that because it's sort of different. And I think, I've always been really, really thrilled with the results. I mean, he sometimes curses me along the way a little bit, but he does. I mean, he's a genius, really.
What was it like, Chris? Apropos of that, I've always been fascinated with this film. Given the music is such a sort of, it feels like it's a complete. You mentioned what goes through for 100 odd minutes, but it feels such a sort of complete piece, so integrated. How difficult was it when you were actually editing and halfway through the process or 2/3 of the way through the process to come in and out of something where I hear it and watch it and think, Christ, did you have to go back to the beginning of the movie every time to feel a cut, or were you?
Every time. No, I mean, I don't know how technical we want to get, but no one's ever mixed music in this way, and no one ever will again. So on the Pro Tools, we track laid, like every single sound in the music is track laid through the entire film. And so rather than cutting the tracks, they're all volume graphed because the automation then shifts down. Otherwise, every time you did a picture cut, you have to recut every single track of thousands of tracks. And what that meant is every time we made a picture cut, the music changed slightly, which was kind of interesting. I mean, it's a very different... I mean, Alex Gibson is the music editor on the film. I mean, he took on board how I wanted him to do it and, smiled politely and said, okay, I'll give it a try. And then we made it work. But it was a nightmare.
But one of the things about that I think is so characteristic of this film, what I was talking about earlier, is so you talked about some rules there for Hans. Love to get to a point where I could ever say to a composer, don't write any tunes. But given that you'd had that conversation, is that then every time, with that sort of genius method of laying the sound of the music out, which in itself has almost a sort of mathematical brilliance about it, every time you're making a cut, you're then deciding to improvise. Yeah. So that this sort of, it seems to me this is so part of what this film is. It's so well planned, and then you kind of sort of dance with it, and sounds like you were doing it even in that.
Yeah, I mean, the music, literally every time we changed a picture, the music would slightly change, and where things came in and out change, and in a completely, not in a random way, but in an arbitrary way. Yeah. And it worked. It was one of those things where it was an experiment, a massive experiment. But we liked how it started to come together, and so we stuck with it. And other than a couple of nervous breakdowns from people working on it, we got there in the end.
Well, I thought that's what was so. But you were asking me about the set. That's what was so ballsy about watching these two, and particularly Christopher up that end of it, where I was. It felt as though I was watching somebody in front of a canvas to which they were responding moment by moment, even though you had kindly arranged for that boat, that ship, and everything else. But so for me, it was really fascinating to see that the planning and then the spontaneity happened. So it was it felt like really felt with a movie like this that it was feeling that creative spark happening the whole time, and that seems to me to be a kind of an example of a kind of point in a career where the confidence of what you do with the bravery of what you're pursuing comes together in an amazing way. It was an amazing thing to watch.
I think that really comes through in the use of the Elgar as well, because it would have been so easy just to say, okay, everyone knows Elgar, let's throw this in as, the hits of the period. But instead it has this kind of mirage-like quality that it just kind of comes in and recedes and then it looks
and it's a piece I love, and I suggested it to Hans in a very tentative way, and I thought he would be upset with me or laugh at me or whatever. But he understood immediately that what I was talking about was finding a way to address it in a very deconstructed way so that you could hint at it. And in the end, he wound up incorporating it really through the entire score, these odd hints of it. And then it comes together at moments, and you get the pleasure of kind of recognizing it, and then it comes apart again. And I think he and Ben Wolfish, his collaborator on that particular piece, they really did a remarkable job of sort of finding the essence of it, but representing it to the audience. Because it was something we knew we couldn't use straight, because it wouldn't fit with the tone of everything else we were doing. But it felt like the right culmination of the emotional approach, because what it said to Hans is we want a very objective music, very unsentimental, very unemotional. And then you trust that towards the end you've earned a sense of emotion. I think it was Hans who first said to me that, I think it was actually Ridley Scott who said this to him. He said, sentiment is unearned emotion. And I thought, well, that's great. You sort of hold that in mind, particularly dealing with this kind of subject matter. Is you really want to feel that you've earned those emotional beats. So you wait as long as you can and then have them come together, hopefully in the right way. But ultimately, it's very subjective. But I really loved what he did with it.
Well, we've reached a very emotional beat in today's proceedings, which is the end. But thank you all very much for coming. Chris, Emma, and Ken, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.